London, May 15th, 1817. The Westbrook Ball glittered like a jewel box opened to the night, its chandeliers casting golden light across the polished marble floors where silk skirts whispered secrets and the orchestra wove melodies that drifted through air thick with the mingled scents of hothouse roses, expensive perfume, and beeswax candles. Eleanor Pembroke stood at the periphery of the ballroom, a familiar position she had long since accepted as her natural place, her gloved hands folded before her as she watched the younger debutantes whirl past in their pastel gowns, their faces bright with hope and anticipation. At 27 years of age, she had moved beyond hope into a quieter country of resignation, where she served as companion to those still young enough to dream of love matches and titled husbands. The modest lavender silk of her gown, chosen more for economy than fashion, marked her as clearly as any sign. A woman past her bloom, a spinster with a small dowry and smaller prospects, content now to fade into the wallpaper while others danced toward their futures. She had made her peace with it, or so she told herself on nights when loneliness did not press too heavily against her ribs. A stir rippled through the assembled guests, a collective intake of breath that drew Eleanor's attention toward the entrance where the Duke of Ashworth had just arrived, tall and commanding in his evening clothes, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his bearing that of a man accustomed to deference and entirely indifferent to it. Eleanor had seen him before, of course, from this same safe distance, and she observed now with detached interest as mothers positioned their daughters in his potential line of sight, as fans fluttered and eyelashes battled, and conversations grew suddenly animated in hopes of catching his notice. The whispers reached even her corner, the same whispers that attended his every appearance. 30,000 a year, vast estates in 3 counties, a lineage stretching back to the Conquest, unmarried still at 35, and therefore the most eligible prize on the marriage market. Eleanor felt no envy, only a faint amusement at the machinations, the desperate hope that masked itself as artless charm. Such pursuits were no longer hers to contemplate. She was about to turn away, to seek out the refreshment room where she might be useful, when quite suddenly the Duke's gaze swept across the ballroom and for one impossible moment seemed to meet hers directly, his grey eyes steady and penetrating even at this distance. Eleanor looked away quickly, her heart giving an unexpected flutter that she immediately dismissed as foolishness, as the reflexive response of a woman who should know better than to imagine herself seen by such a man. It was coincidence, nothing more, his eyes merely passing over her on their way to someone worthier of notice. She smoothed her skirts and lifted her chin, reminding herself that invisibility had its mercies, and returned her tilted attention to her proper role. Observer, not participant, in the grand theatre of other people's romantic possibilities. Eleanor had scarcely found a moment to collect herself when Lady Isabella Montague descended upon her position near the potted palms, her court train of admirers arrayed behind her like soldiers prepared for battle. "My dear Miss Pembroke," Lady Isabella began, her voice carrying that particular tone of false solicitude that always preceded cruelty, "I was just remarking to Lady Hartwell how loyal you are to remain at your aunt's side, season after season, quite the devoted companion, are you not?" The emphasis on the word companion landed like a slap, its implication clear. Eleanor had become little more than a paid attendant, a piece of furniture in her aunt's household. Eleanor maintained her composure, her spine straight despite the familiar ache of humiliation. "My aunt has been generous to me, Lady Isabella," she replied evenly. "I am grateful for her kindness." Lady Isabella's smile sharpened. "Of course you are, and it is admirable truly how you have accepted your situation with such grace. Not every woman can resign herself to spinsterhood with such dignity. I confess I should find it quite unbearable myself. But then I was fortunate enough to secure Lord Montague during my first season. The words were arrows, each one carefully aimed. Another woman in the circle, a younger debutante with more beauty than sense, tittered behind her fan. "It must be difficult," she offered with feigned sympathy. "To watch others dance while one stands aside. I cannot imagine reaching such an age without prospects." Eleanor felt the familiar weight settling over her chest, the knowledge of her position in society's hierarchy, reinforced with each pitying glance and barbed comment. She was 27, unmarried, her modest dowry of £3,000 hardly enough to tempt any gentleman of consequence. Her father's death 5 years prior had left her mother and herself in reduced circumstances, dependent upon the charity of her mother's sister, Lady Catherine Whitmore. Eleanor had been given 1 season at 22, a lackluster affair in which she had been overlooked by every eligible gentleman, her quiet demeanor and unremarkable appearance insufficient to compete with younger, prettier, wealthier girls. She had learned then what she was in the eyes of society: invisible, negligible, a woman whose value had expired before it was ever truly recognized. The resignation had come slowly, settling into her bones like winter cold, until she convinced herself she had made peace with a future of dependence and irrelevance. Before she could formulate another dignified response, Charlotte Fairfax appeared at her elbow like a guardian angel, her kind face flushed with indignation that she was clearly struggling to conceal. "Eleanor, there you are," Charlotte said firmly, linking her arm through Eleanor's. "I have been searching everywhere for you. Come, let us find the refreshment room. I am positively parched." She steered Eleanor away from Lady Isabella's circle with determined purpose, and Eleanor allowed herself to be rescued, grateful beyond words for this singular friend who had never treated her as less than worthy. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Eleanor had scarcely settled back into the ballroom, her heart still racing from Charlotte's rescue, when Lord Frederick Hastings materialized before her in a quiet corridor just beyond the main doors, his expression a mixture of determination and something she could not quite name, but recognized nonetheless as calculation. "Miss Pembroke," he began, his voice too loud in the hushed space, his hands fidgeting with his gloves in a manner that betrayed his agitation. "I wonder if I might have a word with you in private, a matter of some importance." Eleanor felt Charlotte's hand slip from her arm as her friend retreated a few discreet steps, and she nodded to Lord Hastings with cautious courtesy, noting the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow despite the coolness of the corridor. He cleared his throat, glanced behind him as if to ensure they were unobserved, then launched into what could only be described as a proposal, though it lacked any trace of romance or genuine affection. "Miss Pembroke, you are a woman of sense and quiet virtue," he said, his eyes sliding away from hers to focus somewhere over her shoulder. "I find myself in need of a wife who understands the practicalities of matrimony, someone who will not expect foolish sentimentality, but who can manage a household with economy and discretion." Eleanor felt the words land like stones in her chest, each one confirming what she had already suspected. Lord Hastings was known throughout society to be deeply in debt, his estate mortgaged, his creditors growing impatient, and here he stood before her seeking not a wife, but a solution to his financial troubles, her modest £3,000 suddenly transformed in his eyes into salvation. She studied his face, the weak chin, the eyes that would not meet hers, the mouth that spoke of her virtues, while his mind calculated her worth in pounds and pence. "My lord," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation that burned in her throat. "I am sensible of the honor you do me, but I must decline." His expression shifted immediately from nervous hope to something harder, a flash of anger quickly concealed beneath a veneer of politeness. "You decline," he repeated, as if the words made no sense to him. "Miss Pembroke, I do not think you understand your position. You are not likely to receive many such offers. You should consider carefully before refusing." The condescension in his tone stiffened her spine. "I have considered, my lord, and my answer remains unchanged. I will not marry where there is no genuine regard. I would rather remain as I am." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if he wished to say more, then offered a curt bow that barely qualified as courtesy. "As you wish, Miss Pembroke. I hope you do not come to regret your decision when you find yourself with no prospects at all." He turned on his heel and strode back toward the ballroom, leaving Eleanor alone in the corridor, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed them against her stomach. Charlotte reappeared instantly, her face flushed with indignation. "Eleanor," she whispered urgently, "please tell me he did not just propose to you in that mercenary fashion." Eleanor nodded, managing a shaky smile. "He did, and I refused him, though I suspect I have just confirmed society's view that I am a fool." Charlotte embraced her fiercely. "You are no fool. You are worth 1,000 men like Frederick Hastings." They stood together for a moment, Eleanor drawing strength from her friend's loyalty, before returning to the ballroom where she caught sight of the Duke of Ashworth standing near the windows, his grey eyes resting on her with an expression of unmistakable interest that sent a wholly unexpected flutter through her chest, before she dismissed it as impossible and looked away. Eleanor had scarcely recovered her equilibrium from Lord Hastings's mercenary proposal when she found herself intercepted near the refreshment table by Lord George Langley, whose approach was far more polished than his predecessors, but no less calculated beneath its veneer of courtesy. "Miss Pembroke," he began with a practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "I have been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you privately. Might I steal a moment of your time?" She inclined her head, her heart sinking as she recognized the particular intensity in his expression, the same determination she had seen in Lord Hastings's face mere minutes before. Lord Langley guided her to a relatively quiet alcove near the potted ferns, his hand briefly touching her elbow in a gesture that presumed a familiarity they did not share. "Miss Pembroke," he continued, his voice smooth and measured, "I have long admired your quiet dignity and good sense, qualities that are far too rare in society today, and I believe we might suit each other admirably." Eleanor felt the familiar weight of resignation settling over her shoulders, even as she maintained her composure, her years of navigating social situations, despite her peripheral position, lending her a certain protective detachment. "You are very kind, my lord," she replied carefully, "but I confess I am surprised by your attention. We have barely exchanged more than pleasantries in all our acquaintance." He had the grace to look slightly abashed, though his determination did not waver. "That is true," he admitted. "But I have observed you closely, Miss Pembroke, and I believe a union between us would be most prudent. Your family connections through Lady Catherine are impeccable, and your aunt's influence in certain circles would be of considerable benefit, while I could offer you the security of marriage and a respectable position." There it was, Eleanor thought with a clarity that was almost painful. The true nature of his interest laid bare, with only the thinnest pretense of romantic regard. He sought not her but what she represented, the connections she could provide, the modest dowry that might ease whatever financial pressures he faced, the respectability of an alliance with Lady Catherine Whitmore's niece. "Lord Langley," she said gently but firmly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself. "I appreciate your honesty in acknowledging the practical benefits you foresee in such a match. But I must ask you directly, is there any genuine affection in your regard, any true esteem beyond these calculations of advantage?" He faltered, his practiced composure slipping as he realized she had seen through his careful presentation. "Miss Pembroke, well, affection would surely grow with time. These things develop naturally in marriage, and mutual respect is a far firmer foundation than fleeting passion." Eleanor felt a surge of something she had not experienced before. Not mere resignation, but a quiet anger at being valued only for what she could provide, rather than who she was. "My lord," she said with unmistakable finality, "I will not be anyone's prudent choice. I will not marry for convenience or connections. If I am ever to marry, it will be to someone who values me for myself, not for what advantages I might bring. I must decline your offer." His expression shifted from surprise to irritation, a flush creeping up his neck as he absorbed her refusal. "You are making a grave mistake, Miss Pembroke," he said stiffly. "You are hardly in a position to be so particular at your age and with your circumstances. You should be grateful for any respectable offer." The words stung, but Eleanor held his gaze steadily. "Perhaps you are right, my lord, but I would rather face whatever future awaits me with dignity than accept a marriage devoid of genuine regard. I wish you well in finding a wife more suited to your requirements." She turned away before he could respond, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way back toward the ballroom, and she was acutely aware of the whispers that had begun to circulate. The sidelong glances and raised eyebrows, as word spread that Eleanor Pembroke had refused not one but 2 proposals in a single evening, and she heard Lady Isabella's voice rising above the murmurs with cruel clarity. "Who does she think she is? Refusing offers as though she were a diamond of the first water instead of a spinster past her prime." And through it all, Eleanor felt the weight of society's judgment pressing down upon her, even as she held her head high, and she caught a glimpse of the Duke of Ashworth across the room, his grey eyes fixed upon her with an expression of unmistakable interest, and something that looked remarkably like approval, though she dismissed the notion as impossible, and turned away before hope could take root in her bruised heart. Eleanor had scarcely begun to breathe easily after her second refusal, when Lord Philip Sinclair emerged from the crowd with the unmistakable swagger of a man emboldened by wine and the intoxicating thrill of gossip. His face flushed, and his eyes glittering with something that made her stomach tighten with apprehension, even before he reached her side in the center of the ballroom, where she stood frozen like a deer before hunters. "Miss Pembroke," he announced loudly enough that heads turned and conversations faltered, his voice carrying across the polished floor with deliberate projection, "I understand you have been refusing proposals this evening with remarkable frequency, and I have decided to offer you one final opportunity to escape the unfortunate fate of spinsterhood that surely awaits you otherwise." The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the rustle of her own silk skirts, could feel the weight of every eye in the room fixing upon her with avid curiosity and barely concealed malice, and she understood with horrifying clarity that Lord Sinclair had chosen this public venue specifically to humiliate her, to force her hand through sheer social pressure. "You are a sensible woman despite your age and circumstances," he continued with false magnanimity that made her hands clench at her sides, "and I am prepared to overlook your lack of youth and beauty and your modest dowry in order to offer you the protection of my name and the security of marriage. Surely you must see that this is your last chance to avoid becoming a burden to your family and an object of pity to society." Eleanor felt her face burn with humiliation, even as something inside her rebelled against his words, against the assumption that she should be grateful for such condescension, against the idea that any marriage was better than none, regardless of the absence of respect or affection. The temptation rose within her to simply accept, to end this excruciating scrutiny, to secure the safety of a position however loveless. But even as the word yes formed on her tongue, she remembered Lord Hastings' calculating eyes and Lord Langley practical assessment, and she understood with sudden fierce clarity that accepting such a proposal would be a betrayal of everything she valued in herself, that she would rather face whatever lonely future awaited her than spend her life with a man who viewed her as a charitable project. "My lord," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs, "I must decline your generous offer. I am sensible, as you say, sensible enough to know that marriage without genuine regard is no marriage at all, and I will not accept a proposal motivated by pity or by the entertainment value of public spectacle." Gasps rippled through the assembled guests, and Lord Sinclair's face darkened with anger and embarrassment, and somewhere to her left, Eleanor heard Lady Isabella distinctive laugh ringing out with cruel delight. "The foolish creature refuses even Philip Sinclair," Lady Isabella's voice carried across the silence. "Who does she imagine will want her now, a woman of 27 with no fortune and no beauty, and now a reputation for ridiculous pride?" Eleanor felt her composure crack under the weight of judgment pressing down upon her from all sides, felt tears burning behind her eyes, and a desperate need to escape before she broke entirely in front of this audience that waited with barely concealed anticipation for her humiliation to be complete. And she turned blindly toward the terrace doors, seeking air and darkness and solitude where she might collect the shattered pieces of her dignity before anyone could witness her cry. Before Eleanor could reach the sanctuary of the terrace doors, before she could escape the suffocating weight of judgment and mockery that pressed upon her from all sides, a presence materialized at her elbow with such quiet authority that the very air around her seemed to shift and steady, and she turned to find herself looking up into the grey eyes of Alexander Ravenscroft, the Duke of Ashworth, whose expression held none of the pity or amusement she had braced herself to see, but rather a calm concern that made her breath catch in her throat. "Miss Pembroke," he said in a voice that carried just enough to be heard by those nearest them, but no further. His tone infused with a quiet command that seemed to still the whispers surrounding them. "Are you quite well? May I offer you my assistance?" Eleanor struggled to find words, struggled to maintain the composure that had carried her through 3 humiliating proposals and the cruel laughter of Lady Isabella's set, and she was acutely aware that every eye in the ballroom had shifted from her humiliation to this new and utterly unexpected development. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I was just seeking some air. I did not mean to cause such a disturbance." He studied her face for a long moment, and she had the strangest sensation that he saw past the flushed cheeks and trembling composure to the wounded dignity beneath, that he understood in some fundamental way the cruelty she had just endured. "Then permit me to escort you to the terrace," he said, offering his arm with a formality that somehow conveyed both respect and protection. "The evening is warm, and you look as though you could benefit from a moment away from the crowd." Eleanor hesitated, confused by his intervention, and terrified that accepting his assistance would only add fuel to the gossip already burning through the ballroom. But before she could demur, he had gently taken her hand and placed it on his sleeve, his own hand, covering hers briefly in a gesture that steadied her trembling fingers. As they moved toward the terrace doors, Lord Philip Sinclair, emboldened by wine and wounded pride, called out with a sneer that carried across the suddenly silent room, "It seems Miss Pembroke prefers to refuse honest offers while encouraging the attentions of those far above her station. Perhaps her judgment is as impaired as her prospects." The Duke stopped, the sudden stillness of his body conveying a danger that made Eleanor's heart pound with a new kind of apprehension, and he turned slowly to face Lord Sinclair with an expression of such icy disdain that several people audibly gasped. "Lord Sinclair," the Duke said in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, cold and precise and utterly contemptuous, "I have observed the quality of the proposals Miss Pembroke has received this evening, and I must say that her judgment appears to be infinitely superior to that of the gentlemen, and I use that term loosely, who have presumed to offer for her. There is nothing honest about proposals motivated by financial desperation or social climbing, and nothing honorable about making a spectacle of a lady for one's own entertainment. I suggest you examine your own conduct before you presume to question hers." The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the shocked stares of the assembled guests, could sense the shift in the very atmosphere as the Duke's words settled over the company like frost, and Lord Sinclair's face drained of colour before he turned abruptly and disappeared into the crowd. The Duke's hand tightened briefly on Eleanor's where it rested on his arm, and then he guided her smoothly toward the terrace, as though nothing unusual had occurred, his bearing radiating a calm authority that parted the crowd before them like water, and Eleanor moved beside him in a daze of shock and gratitude and confusion, overwhelmed by his defense of her and acutely conscious of his proximity, of the warmth of his arm beneath her trembling fingers, of the faint scent of sandalwood and something indefinably masculine that surrounded him. The cool evening air on the terrace struck Eleanor's flushed cheeks with welcome relief, and she drew in a shaking breath as the Duke guided her away from the doors toward the stone balustrade, where lanterns cast pools of golden light against the darkness of the gardens beyond, the sounds of the ballroom muffled now to a distant hum that seemed to belong to another world entirely. "Miss Pembroke," the Duke said, releasing her arm and turning to face her with a formality that somehow steadied her racing heart. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Ashworth, though I suspect you already knew that." Eleanor managed a curtsy, despite her trembling limbs, her voice emerging steadier than she had expected when she replied, "Your Grace, I am Eleanor Pembroke, and I must thank you for your intervention, though I confess I am not entirely certain why you troubled yourself on my behalf." He studied her face in the lantern light, his grey eyes serious and searching, and then something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger and less formidable. "I must apologize for creating such a scene," he said quietly, "but I find I cannot apologize for the words themselves. I have little tolerance for bullies, and even less for men who presume to humiliate a lady for their own amusement." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at his words, at the genuine anger on her behalf that she heard beneath his measured tone. "I did not require rescue, Your Grace," she said, needing somehow to assert that she had not been entirely helpless. "I had already refused Lord Sinclair before you intervened." He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his austere features into something warm and approachable. "I know you did," he replied, "and most admirably. I confess I acted as much for my own satisfaction as for yours. I cannot abide such conduct, and I found myself unable to remain silent." They stood in silence for a moment, the awkwardness of their situation settling between them, and then the Duke spoke again, his tone curious rather than judgmental. "May I ask why you refused 3 proposals this evening? Surely at least one of them must have been tempting from a practical standpoint." Eleanor felt a spark of something, anger perhaps, or simply the recklessness born of a night that had already stripped away her usual caution, and she lifted her chin to meet his gaze directly. "Because I will not be anyone's convenient choice, Your Grace," she said with the honesty that surprised her. I will not marry a man who views me as a solution to his financial difficulties, or a prudent investment, or a charitable project. I would rather remain a spinster all my days than accept a proposal devoid of genuine regard." The Duke's expression shifted again, something like respect kindling in his eyes as he listened to her words. "That is a brave stance," he said softly. "Particularly given society's view of unmarried women of a certain age, you must have considerable strength of character to maintain such principles in the face of such pressure." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks again, but this time it was not shame, but rather a confused pleasure at being truly seen, truly heard by this man who had no reason to care about her circumstances. "I have had 5 years to reconcile myself to spinsterhood, Your Grace," she replied. "My father's death left us in reduced circumstances, and I had one unsuccessful season before I accepted my situation. I suppose I have simply learned that some fates are worse than loneliness." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on her face with an intensity that made her acutely conscious of every breath she drew. "I understand that rather well," he said finally. "I have been pursued. For my title since I came of age, I am intimately acquainted with proposals motivated by everything except genuine affection or compatibility. It is wearying to be valued only for what one possesses rather than who one is." Eleanor felt something shift between them in that moment, a recognition of shared experience that transcended the vast gulf of their social positions, and she found herself relaxing slightly, despite the strangeness of the situation. The Duke seemed to sense the shift as well, for he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "Miss Pembroke, may I have your permission to call on you tomorrow? I find myself very much wishing to continue this conversation in less dramatic circumstances." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain this entire evening was some fever dream from which she would soon awaken. "You wish to call on me?" she repeated, disbelief coloring every word. He smiled again, that warm transformation of his features. "Very much so, if you will permit it." Eleanor found herself nodding before conscious thought could intervene, before doubt and common sense could reassert themselves. "Yes, Your Grace, you may call, though I confess I cannot fathom why you would wish to." The Duke's words hung in the air between them for one final suspended moment, and then he was offering his arm again and guiding Eleanor back through the terrace doors into the brilliance and heat of the ballroom, where the music still played and dancers still turned in their elegant patterns, but where every head seemed to swivel toward them as they entered, the whispers starting up again like wind through dry leaves, building in intensity as the Duke kept Eleanor's hand tucked firmly into the crook of his elbow and steered her not toward Lady Catherine, but directly across the floor in a path that took them through the very center of the gathered crowd. Eleanor felt the weight of every stare like a physical touch, felt her cheeks burning and her heart hammering against her ribs as she struggled to maintain her composure while the Duke moved with unhurried confidence as though he had every right to command the attention of the entire assembly. And perhaps he did. Perhaps dukes simply existed in a realm where social conventions bent around them like light around the sun. They were halfway across the floor when the Duke paused, his hand tightening briefly on hers in a gesture that might have been reassurance or warning, and then his voice rang out clear and carrying in a tone that demanded attention. "Lady Catherine, I hope you will forgive the presumption, but I believe Miss Pembroke is feeling unwell, and I have taken it upon myself to ensure she is escorted home safely." Eleanor saw her aunt's face across the room, saw the confusion and alarm, and something that might have been calculation flash across those familiar features, before Lady Catherine rallied with admirable speed and began making her way toward them through the crowd that parted before her like water. The Duke did not wait for her aunt to reach them, but turned slightly so that his next words would carry to the assembled guests who had fallen silent with an attention that would have been comical if Eleanor had not been so acutely mortified. "I have observed much this evening," he said in that same clear, carrying tone, his grey eyes sweeping the crowd with an expression that made several people shift uncomfortably, "and I find myself reflecting on the difference between gentlemen and opportunists, between honor and exploitation, between those who understand what it means to value another person and those who view their fellow human beings as mere instruments for their own advancement." The silence that followed his words was absolute and electric, and Eleanor felt simultaneously grateful for his defense of her and horrified by the spectacle they were creating, by the way this would feed the gossip mills for weeks to come, by the impossibility of ever fading back into comfortable invisibility after such public notice. Lady Catherine had reached them now, her face a study in conflicting emotions as she looked from Eleanor to the Duke and back again, and she was opening her mouth to speak when the Duke smoothly took charge again with the effortless authority of a man accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands. "I trust you will permit me to see you both safely to your carriage," he said to Lady Catherine, though his hand had not released Eleanor's arm. "The evening has been eventful, and I believe Miss Pembroke would benefit from rest." Before Eleanor could protest, before Lady Catherine could do more than nod in flustered agreement, before anyone in the stunned ballroom could react, the Duke was guiding them toward the entrance with that same unhurried confidence that suggested nothing unusual was occurring. And then at the very threshold where footmen stood ready with cloaks and the night air drifted in cool and fresh, he did something that would ensure this evening lived in the memory and gossip of society for years to come. He turned to Eleanor, and in a movement so smooth and decisive it seemed choreographed, he swept her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all, ignoring her gasp of shock and her aunt's strangled exclamation and the collective intake of breath from every witness. "This is how a lady should be treated when she is unwell," he said in a voice that carried back into the ballroom, with care and respect and genuine concern for her well-being, and then he was striding out into the night with Eleanor cradled against his chest, her hands clutching at his shoulders for balance, and her mind reeling with shock and confusion and a wild exhilaration she dared not examine too closely. The Duke's carriage was sumptuous beyond anything Eleanor had experienced, with velvet seats in deep burgundy and gleaming brass fittings that caught the light from the carriage lamps, and she found herself pressed into the corner of the seat with her hands twisted together in her lap, while Lady Catherine sat across from her looking between Eleanor and the Duke with an expression that cycled rapidly through shock and calculation and nervous excitement, and the Duke himself sat beside Eleanor with perfect composure, as though carrying women out of ballrooms was something he did regularly, and without particular thought. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed to say once she had gathered sufficient breath and courage, "you have ruined me. That spectacle will be on every tongue in London by morning. My reputation is utterly destroyed." The Duke turned to look at her, and in the dim light of the carriage his expression was thoughtful rather than apologetic. "Miss Pembroke," he said in that calm, measured voice that somehow made everything he said sound reasonable, "your reputation was already being thoroughly shredded by those 3 public proposals and your refusals of them. By this time tomorrow you would have been the object of either pity or mockery, depending on the charitable nature of the gossip. My intervention has merely redirected the speculation into different channels." Eleanor stared at him, trying to process his words through the confusion and shock that still gripped her. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she feared she already knew. He leaned back slightly against the seat, his eyes never leaving her face. "You have a choice in how society will remember this evening," he said. "You can be Miss Pembroke, who refused 3 proposals in one night and was laughed at by Lady Isabella Montague and her set, pitied as the desperate spinster who threw away her last chances at marriage. Or you can be Miss Pembroke, who caught the attention of the Duke of Ashworth in such a manner that he carried her from a ballroom in front of all of society. Which version would you prefer to be whispered about?" Eleanor felt the truth of his words settle over her like cold water, clearing away some of the panic and leaving behind a strange clarity. Lady Catherine made a small noise that might have been agreement or simply overwhelmed confusion. "I suppose when you put it that way," Eleanor said slowly. "But, Your Grace, you did not have to involve yourself so dramatically in my affairs. Surely a simple escort to the carriage would have sufficed." He smiled then, and there was something almost boyish in the expression, despite his commanding presence. "I must apologize for the high-handedness of my actions," he said. "I confess I acted on impulse rather than careful planning. I found myself unable to watch you endure further humiliation without responding, and once I had begun, I discovered I was rather enjoying myself." Eleanor did not know whether to laugh or cry at this admission, at the absurdity of a duke claiming to enjoy creating a scandal on her behalf. The carriage rolled through the London streets, the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones steady and soothing, and the Duke shifted slightly in his seat, so that he was angled toward her more fully. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Pembroke," he said, and the question was so unexpected after everything that had happened that Eleanor could only blink at him in surprise. "What do you wish to know?" she asked cautiously. "Everything," he replied with apparent sincerity. "Your interests, your opinions, how you spend your days, what makes you happy, what you dream about when you allow yourself to dream." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes because no one in 5 years had asked her such questions, had seemed to care about her inner life beyond her utility as a companion or her status as an unmarried burden. "I read," she said finally, her voice soft. "I read everything I can find, novels and poetry and philosophy and history. I walk in the park early in the morning before the fashionable hours. I write letters to my friend Charlotte. I help my aunt with her correspondence and her social obligations. I exist quietly on the margins of other people's lives." The Duke listened with an attention that felt almost physical in its intensity. "And what do you dream about?" he prompted. Eleanor hesitated, then decided that after everything else tonight, honesty could hardly make things worse. "I dream about mattering," she whispered, "about being seen as something other than a failure or an obligation, about having a purpose beyond simply existing until I die." The carriage had stopped, and Eleanor realized with a start that they had arrived at her aunt's house, the familiar facade lit by the lamps on either side of the door. The Duke rose smoothly and handed Lady Catherine down first, then turned to offer his hand to Eleanor with a formal grace. She placed her hand in his and felt the warmth of his touch through her glove as he guided her down to the pavement. "Miss Pembroke," he said, bowing over her hand, "I will call on you tomorrow afternoon if you will receive me." Eleanor found herself nodding, still caught in the unreality of the entire evening. "Yes, Your Grace," she heard herself say. He smiled, released her hand with what seemed like reluctance, and watched as she and her aunt climbed the steps to their door before returning to his carriage, and Eleanor looked back once to see him still watching her before the door closed and shut away the night. The door closed behind Eleanor with a soft, decisive click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the entrance hall, where she and Lady Catherine stood looking at each other in the dim light of the single candle the housekeeper had left burning, and for a long moment neither of them spoke as the enormity of the evening settled over them like a heavy cloak. "Eleanor," Lady Catherine said finally, her voice tight with an emotion Eleanor could not quite identify, "do you have any idea what you have done? What scandal you have created? How this will be talked about in every drawing room in London by noon tomorrow?" Eleanor felt exhaustion sweep over her in a wave so powerful she had to reach out and steady herself against the wall, the smooth, cool plaster grounding her in reality after the dreamlike unreality of the past hours. "I did not create the scandal, Aunt," she said quietly. "3 men proposed to me in the space of 2 hours, and the last did so in front of half of society. I merely declined them, as was my right." Lady Catherine made a sound that was half laugh and half something like despair. "And then the Duke of Ashworth carried you out of the ballroom in his arms. Eleanor, carried you like... She seemed unable to find words adequate to the situation. "Like a heroine in a novel," Eleanor finished softly. "Yes, I am aware of how it appeared." Her aunt moved closer, her face in the candlelight showing worry and calculation in equal measure. "But what does it mean?" she asked. "What are his intentions? Surely he must. That is, a man does not do such a thing unless... Eleanor, do you think he means to court you?" The question hung between them, and Eleanor felt that dangerous spark of hope flare again in her chest, even as she tried to douse it with cold reason. "He said he would call tomorrow," she admitted. "But, Aunt, you must not read too much into his actions. He was being kind. He saw I was distressed, and he intervened, that is all." Lady Catherine's expression shifted to something almost pitying. "My dear child," she said, "the Duke of Ashworth does not need to be kind. Men of his rank and wealth are not kind unless they choose to be, and they certainly do not create massive social scandals out of kindness alone." Eleanor felt tears threaten again, and blinked them back fiercely. "I cannot hope," she whispered. "I cannot allow myself to believe that a man like that would truly be interested in someone like me. It would break me when the truth becomes clear." Her aunt reached out and squeezed her hand briefly before turning toward the stairs. "Go to bed, Eleanor," she said. "Tomorrow will come soon enough, and with it whatever answers the Duke chooses to provide. But I will tell you this, I have watched society for 40 years, and I have never seen a man look at a woman the way he looked at you tonight." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her small room under the eaves, the room she had occupied for 5 years since coming to live with her aunt after her father's death, the room that had become both refuge and prison in its familiar plainness. She sat at her dressing table and looked at her reflection in the wavering candlelight, searching for whatever the Duke might have seen when he looked at her. But she saw only what she always saw, a too thin face with unremarkable features, brown hair that never quite stayed pinned properly, grey eyes that seemed perpetually tired, the face of a woman resigned to invisibility. She undressed slowly, her fingers clumsy on the buttons and laces, and pulled on her nightgown before climbing into bed. But sleep would not come despite her exhaustion. Instead, she lay in the darkness and replayed every moment of the evening, every word the Duke had spoken, every look he had given her, searching for meaning and finding only confusion and that treacherous, persistent hope that refused to be extinguished no matter how firmly she lectured herself about the foolishness of expecting miracles. Eleanor woke the next morning to spring sunlight streaming through her bedroom window with a brightness that felt almost accusatory given the tumultuous darkness of her thoughts through the sleepless night. And for a moment she lay still and wondered if the entire evening had been some sort of fever dream born of exhaustion and loneliness. But then she moved her hand and felt the soreness in her shoulders from being carried, and knew with absolute certainty that it had all been real. She rose and dressed with the help of the maid her aunt employed, a girl named Betsy, who looked at Eleanor with barely concealed curiosity and excitement that suggested the servants had already heard every detail of the previous night's scandal. And Eleanor found she did not have the energy to maintain her usual reserved distance, but instead simply allowed herself to be helped into a day dress of pale blue muslin that she knew did nothing for her coloring, but was at least clean and pressed. When she descended to the breakfast room, She found Lady Catherine already there, with an array of correspondence spread before her, and an expression of such mingled agitation and satisfaction that Eleanor had to suppress an inappropriate urge to laugh. "Good morning, Aunt," she said quietly as she took her seat and accepted a cup of tea from the hovering Betsy. "Good morning indeed," Lady Catherine replied. "We have had 14 calling cards left already this morning, and it is barely past 10. Half of London wishes to call on us this afternoon, no doubt hoping to extract every detail of last night's drama. And there is this." She pushed forward a card of such heavy cream stock that Eleanor knew before looking what it must be. And sure enough, when she picked it up, she saw the Duke of Ashworth's name embossed in elegant script above a message in a bold, masculine hand, expressing his hope that Miss Pembroke had suffered no ill effects from the evening's excitement, and his intention to call at 3 in the afternoon, if that time was convenient. Eleanor set the card down with fingers that trembled slightly and took a sip of tea to cover her confusion, the liquid hot and bracing and ordinary, in a way that helped ground her in reality. "He is coming here," she said unnecessarily. "Of course he is coming here," Lady Catherine said with an edge of impatience. "A man does not behave as he did last night and then simply disappear. Eleanor, you must prepare yourself for the possibility that his intentions are serious." Eleanor shook her head slowly, trying to hold on to the protective cynicism that had sustained her through 5 years of disappointment. "He was being kind, Aunt. He saw a woman in distress, and his chivalrous nature compelled him to intervene. That is all. You must not build castles in the air, or you will make us both ridiculous." Lady Catherine looked at her with an expression Eleanor could not quite interpret, something between pity and exasperation, and perhaps affection. "My dear girl," she said more gently, "I know you have been hurt. I know society has been cruel to you, but the Duke of Ashworth is 32 years old, and has been the most sought-after man in England for over a decade. If he wished merely to be kind, he could have offered you a polite escort to your carriage. He did not need to create the spectacle he created unless he wished to make a statement." Before Eleanor could respond, there was a commotion in the entrance hall, and then Betsy appeared again, looking flustered and excited, carrying an enormous arrangement of white roses and lilies, so extravagant that it must have cost more than Eleanor's dress allowance for an entire year. And behind Betsy came the housekeeper, carrying another arrangement, equally magnificent. And the two women set the flowers on every available surface until the breakfast room looked like a hothouse and smelled of spring and growing things and impossible hope. The drive through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour of 5 in the afternoon was an experience Eleanor had observed countless times from the periphery, but had never imagined experiencing herself. Yet here she sat beside the Duke of Ashworth in his magnificent barouche, drawn by a perfectly matched pair of grey horses, aware with every nerve in her body of the eyes upon them, and the whispers that followed their progress along the wide, tree-lined paths where all of fashionable London came to see and be seen. The Duke handled the ribbons with easy expertise, his attention seemingly focused on his driving, but Eleanor noticed how he angled the carriage to ensure they were visible, how he acknowledged acquaintances with courteous nods but did not stop, how his manner suggested that escorting her was the most natural thing in the world and required no explanation or justification. Lady Isabella Montague stood with her particular friends near the Serpentine, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and envy. As the Duke raised his whip in greeting, but drove past without pausing, and Eleanor felt a small, unworthy surge of satisfaction at the visible consternation her presence in such an elevated position was causing among those who had dismissed her so completely just days before. The Duke glanced at her then, his blue eyes warm with what looked remarkably like approval, and said in a voice pitched for her ears alone, "You are doing splendidly, Miss Pembroke. I know this cannot be comfortable for you, but you carry yourself with remarkable grace. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise, but managed to meet his gaze steadily as she replied, "I confess I feel rather like an exotic creature on display at the menagerie, Your Grace, but I suppose I shall become accustomed to it." He laughed then. Genuine sound of amusement that drew more stares, and said, "Please, when we are private or nearly so, you must call me Alexander. I find I am weary of being your graced to death, and I should like to hear my name in your voice." The intimacy of the request stunned Eleanor into momentary silence. But before she could formulate a response, he continued, "Tell me about your childhood, Miss Pembroke. You mentioned your father was a scholar. Did you share his interests?" The shift in topic steadied her, and she found herself speaking more easily than she had expected, telling him about her father's library and his patient instruction, about learning Latin and Greek alongside her brothers before they went away to school, about the books that had been her refuge and her education. The Duke listened with an attention that seemed absolute, asking questions that revealed genuine interest and surprising knowledge. And when Eleanor hesitantly mentioned her grief at having to sell her father's library to pay debts after his death, she saw something fierce flash across his features before he said quietly, "What books did you most regret losing?" She told him about a first edition of Paradise Lost that had been her father's prize possession, about a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets with her father's notes in the margins, about a travel volume describing Greece that she had read until the pages were soft as cloth. And the Duke nodded slowly as if committing each title to memory before steering the conversation toward his own estate, describing the extensive library there and his hope that she might find it of interest should she ever visit. Eleanor felt hope flutter dangerously in her chest at the casual way he included her in his future plans, at the assumption that their acquaintance would continue and deepen, but she tried to keep her voice steady as she expressed interest in seeing such a collection. Over the course of the next week, the Duke's attentions to Eleanor became impossible for society to dismiss as mere charitable impulse or passing curiosity, and London found itself divided into camps of fascination and scandal, with the more romantic souls sighing over the unexpected courtship, while the rigidly conventional expressed shock that a man of such exalted rank would pursue a woman so clearly past her prime and possessed of no fortune or connections to justify such interest. The Duke called at Lady Catherine's residence every day at 3 in the afternoon with a punctuality that suggested genuine eagerness rather than polite obligation, and he sent flowers each morning with such regularity that Eleanor's sitting room began to resemble a hothouse filled with roses and lilies and exotic blooms she could not name, but whose fragrance followed her through her days, like a reminder that perhaps miracles were possible after all. He escorted Eleanor and her aunt to the theatre, where they sat in his private box and became the object of more attention than the performers. On stage, every opera glass in the house trained upon them as society watched for signs of what this unprecedented courtship might mean and whether it would last beyond the initial excitement. Lady Isabella Montague, whose malice seemed to grow in direct proportion to Eleanor's rising fortune, began a campaign of vicious whispers suggesting that Eleanor must have employed some sort of trickery or manipulation to ensnare the Duke, that perhaps she was not the modest, retiring spinster. She appeared but rather a cunning schemer who had studied the Duke's preferences and manufactured a persona designed to appeal to him. And when that narrative failed to gain sufficient traction, she shifted to darker insinuations about feminine wiles and compromising situations that might have forced his hand. Charlotte Fairfax, loyal as ever, defended Eleanor with a fierceness that nearly resulted in her being cut from Lady Isabella's circle entirely. But Charlotte declared she would rather be excluded from a dozen drawing-rooms than allow her dearest friend to be slandered without response, and her staunch defense won Eleanor other allies among the more fair-minded members of society, who remembered their own struggles against the cruelty of social judgment. Eleanor herself tried to maintain her equilibrium amid the swirling gossip, but at a musical evening at the home of Mrs. Margaret Colborne, she found herself standing near a partially open door and overheard two matrons discussing the Duke's courtship in tones that suggested they believed themselves unobserved. "I cannot fathom what he sees in her," one voice said. "She is plain and aging and brings nothing to the match. Perhaps he has some scheme related to her aunt's influence, or perhaps he is simply amusing himself before making a proper match with a woman of appropriate rank and youth." The words struck Eleanor with the force of physical blows, each syllable confirming every fear she had tried to suppress. And she felt the familiar shame rise in her throat, along with the old conviction that she was indeed unworthy of the Duke's regard, and that eventually he would see her as society did, and realize his mistake. She withdrew to a corner of the room, her hands trembling as she gripped her fan, her mind cataloguing all the reasons the matrons were correct in their assessment, and wondering how she had allowed herself to hope for something so far beyond her reach. Lady Catherine found her there and sat beside her without speaking for a long moment before saying quietly, "You heard something that has distressed you." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and her aunt continued, "The Duke is no fool, Eleanor. He has been pursued by every ambitious mamma and scheming miss in England for more than a decade, and he has never shown the slightest inclination toward any of them until now. Do you truly believe he would invest this much time and public attention in you if his feelings were not genuine?" The words were blunt but kind, and Eleanor felt something loosen slightly in her chest, even as doubt continued to whisper that perhaps her aunt was wrong, that perhaps the Duke's interest would fade once the novelty wore off, and he remembered that he could have anyone. The soiree at Mrs. Colborne's residence continued with musical performances and polite conversation, but Eleanor found herself unable to rejoin the gathering with her usual composure, retreating instead to a small withdrawing room where she stood by the window looking out at the lamp-lit street below and trying to quiet the storm of doubt that had been unleashed by those carelessly cruel words she had overheard. The voices of the two matrons echoed in her mind with relentless persistence, each word a confirmation of fears she had tried desperately to suppress, and she found herself cataloguing once again all the reasons why the Duke's interest could not possibly be what it seemed, why a man of his position and prospects would surely come to his senses and realize that Eleanor Pembroke, with her 27 years and modest inheritance and unremarkable appearance, was a poor choice indeed when he could have any bright young beauty in England. She heard the door open behind her, but did not turn, assuming it was her aunt come to coax her back to the company. But then she heard his voice, low and concerned, asking Miss Pembroke, "Are you unwell?" And her heart gave a painful lurch because of course he had noticed her absence, and of course he had come to find her, and she did not know whether to be grateful or ashamed that she was so transparent to him. Eleanor turned slowly to face him, acutely aware that they were alone in the small room with the door still partially open for propriety, but nevertheless creating an intimacy that made her feel even more vulnerable. And she saw immediately that his expression was serious, his blue eyes searching her face with an intensity that suggested he would not be satisfied with polite evasions. "I am quite well, Your Grace," she managed to say, but her voice betrayed her, and he crossed the room in 3 swift strides to stand before her, close enough that she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "You are not well," he said quietly. "Something has distressed you, and I would know what it is. Has someone said something to upset you?" Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, and hated herself for the weakness. But the events of the past weeks and the constant scrutiny and the weight of her own insecurity had worn away her defenses until she felt raw and exposed. She looked down at her hands, twisting together in an unconscious gesture of anxiety, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, I cannot help but wonder if your attentions, if all of it is real, or if I am deceiving myself into believing something that cannot possibly be true." The Duke went very still, and when Eleanor dared to glance up at him, she saw that his expression had shifted into something fierce and almost angry, though she sensed instinctively that the anger was not directed at her. He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to withdraw, and took both her hands in his grip warm and steady, and said with quiet intensity, "Come with me. We must speak privately and properly." He led her to a small library across the hall, closed the door firmly behind them in defiance of propriety, and turned to face her with an expression that demanded her full attention and honesty, and Eleanor felt simultaneously terrified and hopeful as she waited for him to speak. The Duke handed Eleanor down from his carriage at the entrance to his country estate 2 days later, Lady Catherine settling herself comfortably in the travelling coach with a knowing smile that suggested she had no intention of hovering too closely during their visit, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as she took in the magnificent sprawl of Ashworth Park with its honey-coloured stone glowing in the afternoon sunlight, and its formal gardens stretching in elegant patterns toward distant woodlands that seemed to go on forever into the soft green countryside. She had expected grandeur, of course, for one could not be a duke without possessing estates of considerable magnificence. But she had not expected the way Alexander's face softened as he looked upon his home, nor the gentle pride in his voice as he said quietly, "Welcome to Ashworth, Eleanor. I hope you will come to love it as I do." He did not lead her immediately to the grand entrance, where she could see servants assembling in formal lines to greet their master and his guest, but instead guided her along a side path through an arched gateway covered in climbing roses, whose scent hung heavy and sweet in the warm air, and she realized with a start that he was taking her to see not the public face of his estate, but the private heart of it, the places that mattered to him personally. They walked through gardens that were less formal than those visible from the main approach, wilder and more intimate, where flowers bloomed in profusion and stone benches invited quiet contemplation, and Alexander spoke as they walked, his words coming more freely here than she had ever heard them in London's drawing rooms. He told her of his plans to improve the tenant cottages, to establish a school for the estate children, to modernize the farming methods in ways that would benefit both the land and those who worked it. And Eleanor heard in his voice not the distant benevolence of a nobleman performing expected duties, but genuine care and connection to the people whose lives depended upon his stewardship. She ventured her own thoughts, hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence as she saw how intently he listened, about the importance of considering the tenant's own knowledge and experience, about programs she had read of in agricultural journals that her father had once subscribed to, about the dignity of partnership rather than mere charity. And Alexander stopped walking to turn and look at her with such focused attention that she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You understand?" he said simply. "Most people of our class see estate management as either a tedious duty or an opportunity for profit. But you see the people, the lives, the responsibility of care." They continued to a small building that proved to be his private library. Far more intimate than the formal library in the main house, lined floor to ceiling with books that showed signs of actual reading rather than decorative arrangement, and Eleanor moved along the shelves with growing delight as she recognized favorite authors and discovered volumes she had longed to read but never had access to, while Alexander watched her with an expression that made her heart race. He told her she could come here whenever she wished, that what was his would be hers, and the words seemed to carry weight beyond their surface. Meaning, a promise of true partnership and shared life. In the garden again, he led her to a bench overlooking a small pond where swans glided in serene pairs, and they sat in companionable silence for a long moment, before Eleanor found herself speaking of dreams she had barely acknowledged even to herself, of longing to travel beyond England's shores, to read not just novels but philosophy and history, to matter in some way beyond being merely ornamental, and she half expected him to smile indulgently at such unfeminine ambitions. Instead, he took her hand, his fingers warm and strong as they closed around hers, and the touch sent sensation flooding through her entire body, electric and alive and terrifying in its intensity. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice was like a caress. "You matter. You have always mattered. The world's failure to see your worth does not diminish it." She turned to look at him and found his face very close to hers, his blue eyes dark with emotion she was only beginning to understand, and she knew with sudden crystalline certainty that she was falling in love with him, had perhaps been falling since the moment he had carried her from the ballroom in defiant disregard of propriety and expectation. The knowledge brought fear, sharp and immediate. For to love him was to give him power to hurt her beyond anything society's cruelty had ever achieved. But beneath the fear ran a current of joy so fierce and bright that she could not contain it, and when he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles while holding her gaze, she felt something fundamental shift inside her, a surrender not to him, but to the possibility that she might actually deserve the happiness his presence promised. The happiness Eleanor had felt at Ashworth Park sustained her through the journey back to London, but that fragile joy began to fracture when Lady Catherine informed her 3 days after their return that a gentleman had called asking to see Eleanor urgently, a Mr. Harold Pembroke, who claimed to be her father's cousin and therefore her own relation, and Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, because she knew Harold Pembroke, had met him exactly once at her father's funeral, where he had assessed the modest estate with calculating eyes and made remarks about family duty that had felt more like threats than comfort. She received him in the drawing-room with her aunt present, her posture carefully composed even as anxiety churned within her, and Harold Pembroke proved to be exactly as she remembered, a man of perhaps 45 years with thinning hair and a perpetual expression of aggrieved entitlement, his clothing expensive but slightly outdated, as if he were trying to project a status he did not quite possess. He began with false pleasantries, inquiring after her health and remarking on how well she looked, but his eyes were hard and appraising, and Eleanor felt herself instinctively drawing back as he leaned forward in his chair with the air of a man preparing to deliver unwelcome news disguised as concern. "I have been hearing the most extraordinary rumors, cousin," he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Rumors that the Duke of Ashworth has been paying you particular attention, and naturally, as your nearest male relation, I felt it my duty to call and ascertain the truth of the matter and ensure that you are not being taken advantage of by a man whose intentions may not be honorable." Eleanor felt anger flare hot and immediate at the presumption in his words, at the suggestion that Alexander could be anything but honorable, and she said with careful control that the Duke's attentions were entirely proper and welcome, and were frankly none of Mr. Pembroke's concern. Harold's expression shifted into something harder, the pretense of avuncular concern dropping away to reveal the calculation beneath, and he said bluntly that, as the heir to what little remained of her father's estate, should she remain unmarried, he had every right to concern himself with her affairs, particularly when she seemed determined to throw herself away on a man who was clearly amusing himself at her expense. The words struck at Eleanor's deepest insecurities, the fears she had been fighting so hard to overcome, and she rose from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster, and informed Mr. Pembroke that his visit was concluded and his opinions unwelcome. He stood as well, his face flushing with anger, and said that she was a fool if she believed a duke would actually marry a woman of her age and circumstances, that she was setting herself up for ruin and humiliation, and that when the duke inevitably abandoned her, She should not expect Harold to clean up the mess of her reputation or her prospects. Lady Catherine, who had been silent until now, rose with surprising authority and rang for the butler, instructing that Mr. Pembroke be shown out immediately, and Harold left with a final warning that Eleanor would regret not listening to the counsel of her family and that there would be consequences for her stubborn pride. When he had gone, Eleanor sank back into her chair, trembling with a mixture of rage and fear, because while she knew his words were motivated by his own selfish interest in maintaining his claim to her modest inheritance, they had nonetheless struck at the heart of her vulnerability and awakened all the doubts she had been trying so desperately to silence. Lady Catherine came to sit beside her, taking her hand with uncharacteristic gentleness, and said that Harold Pembroke had always been a grasping, unpleasant man, and that his opinion was worth less than nothing. But Eleanor could not quite shake the cold weight of dread that had settled over her, the fear that perhaps he was right, and she was deceiving herself about Alexander's intentions and the reality of their future together. The Duke called on Eleanor the very next afternoon, arriving precisely at the hour when Lady Catherine would customarily be taking her tea in the conservatory. And when the butler showed him into the drawing-room, Alexander took one look at Eleanor's pale face and the tension in her shoulders, and asked the butler to inform Lady Whitmore that he required a brief private word with Miss Pembroke on a matter of some urgency, the authority in his voice such that the servant bowed and withdrew without question, despite the impropriety of leaving them unchaperoned. Eleanor stood near the window where the afternoon light seemed to illuminate every line of worry on her face, and Alexander crossed the room to her with swift concern, taking her hands in his and finding them cold despite the warmth of the day, and he said gently, "Eleanor, what has happened? You are distressed." She tried to smile, to dismiss his concern, but found she could not maintain the pretense under the steady kindness of his gaze, and the words came spilling out in a rush of fear and confession, all the poison that Harold Pembroke had planted in her mind about how she was not enough, how Alexander would surely come to regret his choice, how society would never truly accept their union, how she was bringing him nothing but trouble and scandal when he deserved a bride who would be an asset to his position rather than a liability to his reputation. She spoke of her age, her modest circumstances, her complete lack of the accomplishments and connections that a duchess should possess, and she heard her voice breaking as she said that perhaps Harold was right, and she was being foolish and selfish to imagine that she could ever truly be worthy of the life Alexander was offering her. He listened without interruption, his hands tightening around hers, and when she finally fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring of all her deepest insecurities, he drew her to the sofa and sat beside her, not releasing her hands but holding them as if they were something infinitely precious. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rougher than she had ever heard it, raw with an emotion that made her heart clench. "I need you to listen to me. Truly listen, because I am going to tell you something I have never told another living soul." He paused, seeming to gather himself, and then continued with quiet intensity that held her absolutely still. "I have been the Duke of Ashworth since I was 19 years old, when my father died and left me with a title, vast estates, and responsibilities that terrified me. And from that moment forward, I have been pursued, courted, flattered, and sought after by every family with a marriageable daughter in England." He smiled without humor, his blue eyes dark with memory. "I have been loved for my rank, for my wealth, for the consequence I could bring to a family, but never, not once in 13 years, has anyone looked at me and seen Alexander, just Alexander, the man beneath the title who is lonely and uncertain and desperately hoping that somewhere in this world there is someone who might value him for who he is rather than what he possesses." His voice dropped lower, became almost a whisper. "And then I saw you across that ballroom, standing alone with such dignity, while cruelty swirled around you. And I watched you refuse 3 proposals from men who saw you as convenient rather than cherished. And I saw a woman who valued herself enough to demand genuine regard. And I thought, there is someone who understands what it means to be valued for one's true self rather than surface attributes. Eleanor was weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face, and Alexander reached up to brush them away with gentle thumbs. "I am falling in love with you, Eleanor Pembroke," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something, a vulnerability she understood because she felt it herself. "I have been falling in love with you since that night, and it has nothing to do with duty or convenience, and everything to do with the fact that when I am with you, I feel seen and known and valued in a way I have never experienced, and the idea that you think you are not enough, when you are everything I have been searching for without knowing it, breaks my heart." She could not speak, could only look at him through her tears, and he said softly, "I know you are afraid. I am afraid too. Terrified that I will somehow fail you or lose you. But Eleanor, my darling Eleanor, please do not let the cruel words of small-minded people rob us of what we might have together. Please trust what we have found. Trust me. Trust yourself." And Eleanor, feeling something break open in her chest, said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I love you, Alexander. I love you so much it frightens me." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, and they sat together in the afternoon light, hands clasped, fears confessed, 2 lonely people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, and the weight of mutual vulnerability settled between them, not as burden, but as the foundation of something real and true and worth fighting for. Alexander sent a note to Eleanor 3 days after their confession in the drawing room, the message brief but carrying an undertone of significance that made her heart quicken as she read the careful script, requesting that she and Lady Catherine join him for a private dinner at his London residence on Friday evening, and Eleanor spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation that she tried and failed to hide from her aunt, who watched her with knowing eyes and made no comment except to insist that Eleanor wear her finest gown, the blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes and made her feel almost beautiful. The evening arrived with a soft spring rain that misted the streets and made the carriage lamps glow with haloed light, and Eleanor sat beside her aunt watching the city pass in a blur of wet cobblestones and golden windows, her hands twisting in her lap until Lady Catherine reached over and stilled them with a gentle touch and a small, encouraging smile. The Duke's London residence was a magnificent townhouse in Mayfair, all elegant proportions and understated wealth, and Alexander himself met them at the door, his eyes finding Eleanor's immediately with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he took her hand and held it, perhaps a moment longer than propriety dictated, before greeting Lady Catherine with warm courtesy. The dinner was intimate, served in a smaller dining room rather than the grand formal space, and Alexander kept the conversation light and easy, drawing Lady Catherine into discussions of books and music and the latest theatrical productions. But Eleanor could sense an undercurrent of purpose beneath his charm, a tension in the set of his shoulders that suggested he was working toward something. When the meal concluded, he suggested they retire to the music room for coffee, and Lady Catherine, bless her, claimed a sudden need to rest her eyes after the rich food, and settled herself in a comfortable chair by the fire in a corner of the room with her book, positioned where she could technically chaperone while being effectively out of earshot. Alexander led Eleanor to the far end of the room, where tall windows overlooked the rain-soaked garden, and she noticed for the first time that the space had been transformed, dozens of white roses in crystal vases filling the air with delicate perfume, and candles glowing on every surface, casting everything in soft, romantic light. "Alexander," she whispered, "what is all this?" And he turned to face her, taking both her hands in his expression serious and tender, and slightly nervous in a way that made him seem younger and more vulnerable. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I have spent the last 3 days thinking about what you told me, about your fears and doubts, and about what I confessed to you about my own loneliness and my search for someone who could see me truly. And I have come to realize that I do not want to wait any longer. I do not want to waste another day of my life without knowing that you will be by my side, not just now, but always." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, and she could barely breathe as he slowly, deliberately lowered himself to one knee before her, his hands still holding hers, his blue eyes locked on her face with absolute focus. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring of breathtaking beauty, a sapphire the color of midnight surrounded by small diamonds that caught the candlelight and threw it back in brilliant sparks. "This ring belonged to my mother," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was the only piece of her jewelry my father could not bear to part with after she died, and he gave it to me on his deathbed, and told me to give it only to a woman I loved with my whole heart, a woman who would be my true partner in every sense." Eleanor was crying now, tears streaming silently down her face, and Alexander smiled up at her with such love that she felt her heart might break from the fullness of it. "Eleanor Pembroke," he said, "you are that woman. You are everything I have been searching for without knowing it. You see me not as a duke, but as a man. You challenge me and comfort me, and make me believe that I might deserve happiness. And I love you more than I thought it possible to love anyone." He paused, drew a shaking breath, and said, "Will you marry me? Not because it is suitable or convenient or expected, but because you love me as I love you. Because together we might build a life of genuine partnership and joy, because I cannot imagine spending my days with anyone but you." "Yes," Eleanor whispered, then said it again louder, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, Alexander, yes, I will marry you. I love you so much." He rose swiftly, slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her, and then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness and passion that made the world fall away until there was nothing but the two of them, and this perfect, transcendent moment of promise and love. Alexander insisted they announce the engagement not quietly, through the usual channels of morning calls and printed notices, but publicly and immediately in a manner that would leave no room for society to question his intentions or diminish what Eleanor meant to him. And so 2 days after the proposal, he escorted her to the theatre, choosing an evening when he knew all of fashionable London would be in attendance for the opening night of a celebrated new production. Eleanor wore a gown of deep green silk that Alexander had sent to her along with the emerald necklace that had belonged to his grandmother. And when she protested the extravagance, he had simply fastened the stones around her throat himself, and told her that she should begin to accustom herself to being adorned as befitted her position as his future wife, the possessive pride in his voice making her heart race. They arrived fashionably late, entering the theatre when the boxes were already filled and the lobby crowded with society's elite taking the air before the performance. And Eleanor felt every eye turn toward them as Alexander guided her through the crowd with his hand firmly at her back, his bearing that of a man who was utterly certain of his choice and prepared to defend it against any who might dare to question. He had secured the Duke's box, the most prominent in the theatre, positioned where they would be visible to virtually everyone in the house. And as they took their seats, Eleanor was acutely aware of the whispers rippling through the audience, The opera glasses turned in their direction, the speculation that was surely intensifying with every moment. Lady Catherine sat to Eleanor's left, beaming with unconcealed delight, while Alexander remained standing, his tall figure commanding attention. And when the interval arrived and the theatre erupted into the usual social chaos of visiting between boxes, he did not sit, but instead drew Eleanor to her feet and positioned her beside him at the front of the box, where the light from the chandeliers illuminated them both. He raised his hand for silence, and such was his authority that the murmur of conversation actually died away, hundreds of faces turning upward to look at them with undisguised curiosity. And Alexander said, in a voice that carried clearly through the theatre, "I have the great honor to announce my engagement to Miss Eleanor Pembroke, and I hope you will all join me in celebrating the fact that the most intelligent, compassionate, and remarkable woman in England has consented to become my Duchess." The silence held for one breath, two, and then the theatre erupted, applause and exclamations of surprise and a few gasps of shock. And Eleanor stood frozen beside Alexander, her hand in his, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her, and seeing in the faces below a kaleidoscope of reactions. Lady Isabella Montague sat in a box across the way, looking as though she had been struck, her face pale and her mouth compressed into a thin, bitter line, while beside her several other ladies who had whispered cruel things about Eleanor over the years stared upward with expressions ranging from disbelief to poorly concealed envy. But there were other faces too, Charlotte's among them, her dear friend standing in her family's box, with tears streaming down her cheeks and her hands clasped in joy, and Mrs. Colburn nodding with satisfaction, as though this were exactly what she had expected all along, and countless others whose expressions held genuine warmth and approval. People began to move toward their box immediately, a stream of well-wishers climbing the stairs to offer congratulations, and Alexander kept Eleanor close to his side, his arm around her waist in a gesture that was slightly improper and absolutely unmistakable in its possessiveness and pride. Lord Frederick Hastings appeared, mumbled, something awkward about felicitations, his eyes not quite meeting Eleanor's, and Lord George Langley bowed with better grace and admitted that the Duke was a fortunate man, while Lord Philip Sinclair was notably absent, having apparently found pressing business elsewhere in the theatre. Charlotte reached them and embraced Eleanor with such force that she nearly knocked her over, whispering fierce declarations of happiness and vindication, and Lady Catherine accepted congratulations with queenly graciousness, as though she had orchestrated the entire affair. Through it all, Alexander remained steady at Eleanor's side, deflecting the occasional pointed question about the suddenness of the engagement or the unconventional nature of their courtship, with cool courtesy that nevertheless made clear he would tolerate no impertinence. And Eleanor found herself standing straighter, holding her head higher, bolstered by the absolute certainty of his regard, and the public declaration he had just made of her value. As the crowd finally began to disperse, and they returned to their seats for the second half of the performance, Alexander leaned close and whispered, "Are you all right?" And Eleanor turned to look at him, this man who had seen her when she was visible, who had valued her when she was dismissed, who had just claimed her before all of society with unmistakable pride. And she said softly, "I am more than all right. I am happier than I ever imagined possible." He smiled and lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles where his mother's sapphire glowed in the light. And Eleanor understood that she had been transformed not because she had changed, but because she was finally, truly, seen and cherished for exactly who she was. The weeks between the announcement and the wedding passed in a blur of activity that left Eleanor dizzy with wonder and occasional moments of disbelief that this was truly her life now, not some elaborate dream from which she would wake to find herself back in her modest room, attending to her aunt's correspondence and resigning herself to spinsterhood. Alexander refused to be relegated to the periphery of the planning as most bridegrooms were, instead involving himself in every detail from the flowers that would decorate the church to the menu for the wedding breakfast. And his primary concern in every decision was not what would impress society or maintain his consequence, but what would please Eleanor, what would make her happy, what would honor her preferences and dreams. He commissioned a complete wardrobe for her from London's finest modiste, and when Eleanor protested the extravagance and tried to limit the order, he had looked at her with such tender exasperation and said that he was not attempting to change her or dress her as society expected a duchess to appear, but rather to provide her with beautiful things because she deserved them and because he took joy in seeing her adorned as befit. Not her new position, but her essential worth. He took her to meet his steward at the country estate, included her in conversations about crop rotations and tenant improvements and estate business that most men would have considered far too tedious or complex for female comprehension. And when she offered a thoughtful suggestion about establishing a small school for the tenant children, he had looked at her with such pride and immediately instructed the steward to begin investigating the practicalities. Eleanor found herself growing into a confidence she had never known she possessed, stepping out of the protective shell of resignation and diminishment she had built around herself over years of being overlooked, and she marveled at how different the world appeared when viewed through the eyes of someone who was valued and consulted and respected. She and Alexander stole moments of privacy whenever they could manage it under Lady Catherine's increasingly indulgent chaperoning, walking in the gardens of his London residence with their hands clasped together, sitting close on the settee in her aunt's drawing-room, discussing poetry and philosophy and their hopes for the future, and once, memorably, sharing a kiss in the shadowed alcove of a gallery they were visiting that had left Eleanor breathless and trembling, and Alexander looking at her with such hunger, tempered by restraint, that she had understood for the first time the true depth of the passion that existed beneath his gentleman's control. Their connection deepened daily, moving beyond the romantic attraction that had first drawn them together into something richer and more substantial, a partnership of minds and spirits that felt to Eleanor like coming home to a place she had not known existed. She wrote long letters to Charlotte, filled with details of her happiness and confessions of her lingering disbelief that she, Eleanor Pembroke the wallflower, the spinster, the overlooked and dismissed, was about to marry a duke who loved her, not despite who she was, but because of it, and Charlotte wrote back with jubilant responses, declaring that this was exactly what Eleanor had always deserved, and she had never doubted for a moment that Eleanor would find her happiness, even when Eleanor had given up hoping for it herself. The wedding took place on a brilliant June morning at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, where London's most fashionable and distinguished marriages were solemnized, and from the moment Eleanor woke in her aunt's house for the last time, as Miss Pembroke, she felt as though she were moving through a dream that at any moment might dissolve into the familiar disappointment of her previous reality. Lady Catherine and Charlotte attended her as she dressed, helping her into the gown of ivory silk that caught the light with every movement and made her skin glow warm and luminous. And when Charlotte fastened the strand of pearls that had belonged to Eleanor's mother around her neck, Eleanor met her own eyes in the mirror and saw not the resigned wallflower who had attended the Westbrook ball mere weeks ago, but a woman on the threshold of a happiness she had never dared to imagine possible. The church was filled to capacity when she arrived, every pew packed with members of society who had come as much to witness the spectacle of the Duke of Ashworth's unexpected choice as to offer genuine felicitations. But Eleanor found as she stood at the back of the church with her hand resting on her uncle's arm that she did not care what motivated their attendance, because at the far end of the aisle, Alexander waited for her, tall and striking in his formal attire, and the expression on his face as he watched her approach was one of such unmistakable love and awe that everything else fell away into insignificance. She walked toward him with steady steps, her eyes locked on his, and she saw the way his throat worked as he swallowed, the slight tremor in his hands that he clasped behind his back, the absolute naked emotion in his gaze that told her more clearly than any words that he was as overwhelmed by this moment as she was. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, the familiar words of the marriage service falling like blessings around them. And when the moment came for them to exchange their vows, Eleanor's voice rang out clear and strong, surprising herself with the certainty that filled her as she promised to love and honor and cherish this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had valued her when she was dismissed, who had chosen her not despite who she was, but because of it. Alexander's hand trembled slightly as he took hers to place the wedding band beside the engagement ring, his fingers warm and steady despite that small betraying shake. And when he spoke his vows, his voice was low and fierce with emotion, his eyes never leaving hers as he promised before God and all assembled to love her for all the days of his life. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander stepped forward and framed her face with both hands and kissed her with such exquisite tenderness that Eleanor heard several ladies in the congregation sigh and at least one weep audibly, and in that kiss she tasted promise and passion and the sweetness of being wholly and irrevocably cherished. The wedding breakfast at Alexander's London residence was a lavish affair with endless courses and champagne flowing freely and toasts offered by various dignitaries. But Eleanor was aware only of her husband beside her, his hand finding hers beneath the table and holding it gently, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a private caress that sent warmth flooding through her. When at last they were able to take their leave, departing amid a shower of flower petals and the cheers of well-wishers for the journey to his country estate, where they would spend the first weeks of their marriage, Eleanor looked back once at the assembled crowd and caught Charlotte's eye, her dear friend beaming through happy tears, and then Alexander handed her into the carriage and climbed in after her, and they were finally, blessedly alone. The country estate enfolded Eleanor and Alexander in a privacy and peace that felt like sanctuary after the whirlwind of their courtship and wedding. And in those first weeks of marriage, Eleanor discovered dimensions of happiness she had not known existed in her careful catalogue of what life might offer. Alexander insisted on showing her every corner of his world, from the grand staterooms that were opened only for the most formal occasions, to the small study where he conducted his estate business, to the rambling gardens that had been his mother's pride, and which he had maintained lovingly in her memory. And in each place he asked for Eleanor's thoughts and opinions, not as polite courtesy, but with genuine interest in her perspective, implementing her suggestions with an eagerness that made her understand he truly meant for her to be his partner in all things. The household staff, accustomed to years of bachelor management under their duke's capable but solitary direction, regarded Eleanor with initial uncertainty that was perhaps tinged with protective wariness on behalf of their master, whom they served with deep loyalty. But her genuine kindness and interest in their lives and concerns, her willingness to learn the rhythms and traditions of the household rather than immediately imposing changes, and most of all, the transparent happiness that radiated from the Duke whenever she entered a room, won them over with surprising swiftness until Eleanor found herself welcomed and supported by everyone from the stern housekeeper to the youngest scullery maid. She discovered in herself a talent for the practical work of estate management that surprised her, finding satisfaction in reviewing household accounts and consulting with tenants about their needs and organizing improvements to the cottages where Alexander's people lived, and Alexander watched her natural authority and competence emerge with visible pride and deepening love. Their physical intimacy, which Eleanor had approached with equal parts anticipation and trepidation born of innocence, and the vague warnings unmarried ladies received about marital duties, proved to be a revelation of tenderness and passion that left her marveling at the joy of being desired and cherished and known in the most intimate sense. And Alexander's patient consideration combined with his own evident pleasure in their union taught Eleanor that this aspect of marriage was not duty, but gift, not obligation, but celebration. They spent long summer evenings in his library, reading aloud to one another, or engaged in animated discussions of philosophy and literature, and they walked together through the estate planning future improvements and dreaming aloud about the life they would build together. And sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, doing nothing more than existing in one another's presence, which Eleanor found as precious as any conversation. She wrote in the journal Alexander had given her as a wedding gift about the miracle of being truly seen by another person, of being valued not despite her qualities, but because of them, of waking each morning to the astonishing reality that she was loved and desired and deemed worthy of sharing the life of a man she admired and adored, and she reflected with something between wonder and grief on how close she had come to resigning herself to a half-life of perpetual invisibility, never knowing that fullness like this existed and might be hers. They returned to London for the season in early autumn, when society reassembled after the summer dispersal to country estates and seaside retreats, and Eleanor discovered that entering the social world as the Duchess of Ashworth was an experience entirely different from every previous encounter she had endured as Miss Pembroke, the overlooked spinster. The transformation was not in herself, for she was still fundamentally the same woman who had stood at the periphery of the Westbrook ball mere months ago, but in how she was perceived by those who had previously dismissed her as insignificant. And there was something both gratifying and unsettling in watching people who had treated her with casual cruelty now approach her with deference and eagerness for her notice. Lady Isabella Montague, who had mocked her so viciously, now smiled with brittle determination whenever their paths crossed, and spoke with false warmth about how she had always known Eleanor possessed hidden qualities. And Eleanor met these overtures with cool politeness that fell just short of rudeness, unwilling to pretend the past had not occurred, but equally unwilling to engage in open hostility that would reflect poorly on Alexander. The three lords who had proposed to her that fateful night exhibited varying degrees of discomfort in her presence, with Lord Frederick Hastings avoiding her entirely, Lord George Langley offering stiff congratulations that suggested genuine chagrin, and Lord Philip Sinclair maintaining a sullen distance that occasionally manifested in snide comments made just loudly enough for her to overhear about social climbing and undeserved elevation. Alexander, attuned to every slight directed at his wife, responded to these instances with icy courtesy that made clear any disrespect toward the Duchess would be remembered and answered, and Eleanor found herself both protected by his position and increasingly confident in her own right to occupy the space she now held. Charlotte, now her closest confidant and frequent visitor, delighted in the social reversal and reported with glee the various comments and reactions she observed among those who had dismissed Eleanor, and together they laughed at the absurdity of a world that valued her only once a powerful man had proclaimed her valuable. Yet Eleanor found she could not entirely embrace the satisfaction of vindication because she understood too well that the same arbitrary cruelty that had once been directed at her was now being visited upon other women deemed wanting by society's merciless standards, and she began quietly using her new influence to extend kindness and recognition to those wallflowers and spinsters who reminded her of her former self. Mrs. Margaret Colburn, the kindly older widow who had always treated Eleanor with respect, became a particular friend and ally in these efforts, and together they hosted small gatherings that included women's society overlooked, creating spaces where intelligence and character were valued above youth and conventional beauty. Alexander supported these endeavors wholeheartedly, proud of Eleanor's compassion and her refusal to forget where she had come from, and he often remarked that her generosity of spirit was among the qualities he most admired in her. At a particularly glittering ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Somerset, Eleanor stood beside her husband receiving guests and caught sight of a young woman of perhaps 25 standing alone near the windows, with the resigned expression Eleanor recognized all too well, and she excused herself from Alexander's side and crossed the room to engage the woman in conversation, learning her name was Miss Sarah Thornton, and that she had been in London for 3 seasons without receiving a single offer. Eleanor spent the remainder of the evening ensuring Miss Thornton was introduced to suitable partners and included in conversations, and when she rejoined Alexander, he took her hand and raised it to his lips and told her she was extraordinary. The months that followed their return to London brought Eleanor a profound understanding that true transformation was not about claiming vindication over those who had wronged her, but about using her newfound position to reshape the very systems that had caused such pain, and she threw herself into this work with a passion that surprised even Alexander, who had known from the beginning that his wife possessed hidden depths of compassion and determination. She began hosting regular afternoon gatherings at Ashworth House, specifically designed to bring together women of varying ages and circumstances, creating a space where the wallflowers and spinsters and widows whom society dismissed as insignificant could find fellowship and support and recognition of their inherent worth. And Mrs. Margaret Colburn became her devoted partner in these efforts, the two of them carefully curating guest lists that mixed the socially powerful with the socially vulnerable in ways that gently challenged the rigid hierarchies that had caused Eleanor such suffering. Miss Sarah Thornton, the young woman Eleanor had befriended at the Somerset ball, became a regular attendee and gradually blossomed under the warmth of genuine acceptance, her natural wit and intelligence emerging once she no longer felt the crushing weight of constant judgment, and Eleanor experienced a particular joy in watching this transformation that reminded her of her own journey from invisible wallflower to celebrated duchess. Alexander observed his wife's charitable work with undisguised pride and actively supported her efforts by ensuring that the men in his social circle treated these gatherings with respect rather than condescension, and he made a point of dancing with the wallflowers at balls and engaging the overlooked women in conversation at parties, using his considerable social influence to signal that intelligence and character deserved recognition regardless of age or conventional beauty. Yet Eleanor discovered that not all battles could be won through gentle influence and kindness, for Lady Isabella Montague continued her campaign of subtle cruelty, directed now not at Eleanor, whom she could no longer safely attack, but at the women Eleanor championed, making pointed remarks about charity cases and social climbers whenever she encountered Eleanor's protégés at social events. The situation came to a head at a particularly glittering reception hosted by the Countess of Pemberton, when Lady Isabella made a cruel comment within Eleanor's hearing about Miss Thornton being a pitiful hanger-on who survived only through the Duchess's misplaced sympathy, and Eleanor felt something cold and fierce rise within her that was entirely different from the resigned acceptance with which she had once endured similar cruelty directed at herself. She crossed the room with deliberate purpose, Alexander immediately sensing the shift in her demeanor and following close behind, and she addressed Lady Isabella with a voice that carried just far enough to be heard by those nearby, but not so far as to create an obvious scene, speaking with icy precision about the difference between those who possessed genuine character and those who possessed only malice, disguised as social commentary. Lady Isabella sputtered and attempted to laugh off the rebuke, but Eleanor continued with calm relentlessness, suggesting that a woman who derived satisfaction from diminishing others revealed far more about her own inadequacies than about her targets, and perhaps Lady Isabella might consider whether her desperation to feel superior suggested a deep insecurity about her own value beyond the accidents of birth and fortune. The silence that followed Eleanor's words stretched like a taut thread in the glittering reception room, and Lady Isabella's face underwent a fascinating transformation from confident malice through shocked affront to pale humiliation. As the reality settled that the woman she had once tormented with impunity now possessed both the social position and personal conviction to publicly challenge her cruelty without consequence. Alexander moved to stand beside Eleanor, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back in a gesture of unmistakable support, and his presence seemed to amplify her words as the nearby guests absorbed what had just transpired with expressions ranging from scandalized delight to uncomfortable recognition of their own complicity in similar cruelties. Lady Isabella attempted to muster a laugh and dismiss the rebuke as a misunderstanding, but her voice emerged thin and unconvincing, and when she looked around for support from her usual confederates, she found them suddenly absorbed in examining their fans or finding urgent reasons to drift toward other conversations. Eleanor felt no triumph in the moment, only a bone-deep weariness at the necessity of such confrontations, and a fierce determination that the women she had taken under her protection would not suffer the same casual destruction she had endured, and she held Lady Isabella's gaze with calm implacability until the other woman made some excuse about needing to greet an acquaintance and retreated with what remained of her dignity in tatters. Alexander leaned close and murmured that he had never been more proud of her, and Eleanor realized that she had finally achieved what she had never managed during those years of quiet endurance, which was not acceptance by those who had deemed her wanting, but the strength to define her own worth, independent of their judgment, and to use her position to shield others from the same arbitrary cruelty. The remainder of the evening passed in a kind of ripple effect as word spread of the confrontation, and Eleanor found herself approached by several women who had previously treated her with indifference or condescension. Women who now seemed suddenly aware that the Duchess of Ashworth was not merely a social ornament to be courted for her husband's influence, but a force in her own right who would not tolerate the casual destruction of those society deemed insignificant. Miss Thornton found Eleanor later and embraced her with tears of gratitude, saying she had never imagined anyone would defend her so publicly and fiercely, and Eleanor held the younger woman close and told her that every person deserved to be defended, that the accident of age or appearance or fortune should never determine human worth. When she and Alexander finally returned home to Ashworth House in the early hours of the morning, he drew her into his arms in the privacy of their chambers and spoke against her hair about how he had fallen in love with a woman of quiet dignity who endured society's cruelties with grace, but he had discovered himself married to a warrior who would reshape that society's very foundations, and he could not fathom how he had been fortunate enough to find her standing at the edge of a ballroom that night, refusing proposals from men who could not begin to comprehend her value.